Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Legend of Devslopes. We are continuing on, and in this video we are going to get the attack for the enemies working and the health for the player. So it's going to be a pretty big one, so strap yourselves in and get ready to do some scripting. We're going to do quite a bit of coding in this lecture, so let's get started. Down here in the scripts, first thing we are going to do is create a new C# script called the Game Manager. Just like you've done in the previous videos with the Flappy Bird and with the tower defense, we are going to have a game manager that monitors the state of the game. For instance, the first thing we're going to check out for is whether the player is alive or not. And so we're going to open that up and just going to pull that over here. And let's get started. So this is going to be a public static instance of the game manager. So what we're going to do is we're going to write public static game manager, and we're going to say instance is equal to null to start out. And then in the awake, we're going to create void awake. And we are just going to do a check to see if there is an instance of the game manager, and if not, to set it to this. We're going to say if instance is equal to null, then instance is equal to this. Else if instance does not equal this, then we are going to destroy that game object. So this just makes sure that there's only one instance of the game manager at a time. Close that up, and then we're going to say don't destroy on load game object. Alright, so that takes care of the creation of our game manager instance on awake. And so now let's see what we want to work with. So in our other scripts, instead of having a get component where we're looking for the player, we're going to actually just go ahead and have one instance of our hero, and that's going to be saved here in the game manager. So we are going to say serialize field, and that's going to be of type game object, and we're going to call that player. And we are going to be monitoring through the game manager the status of our game. So the game is over when the hero dies. It's not over when we're still alive. So we're going to need a private bool, and we're going to call this game over, and it's going to initially be false. But since we're being good little programmers and we are encapsulating our data and setting things private, we need to have getters for this information. So we are going to say public bool game over. And so all we're doing is we're just creating our public version of our bool, and we're going to just say get return game over. Okay, so the private instance is lowercase and our public getter is capitalized. Okay, and then we need a semicolon here. We're also going to do the same thing for our player. So we're going to say, actually I'm just going to copy this, and we are saying here we have a game object, and our game object is player, and we are returning lowercase player. All right, there we go. So now we got our getters for our game over bool as well as our game object player. So it looks good. Whoops. Looking good so far. And what we're going to do is I'm going to create a public function down here at the bottom, and it won't have any functionality quite yet. We're going to work on that when we get to the player's health script, but I'm going to go ahead and put it in so that we have it when we need it. So I'm just going to say public void player hit, and we're going to pass into it the current hit points of the player. And we're just going to do a check and see if the current hit points is greater than 0, or in other words, if we're still alive. Then game over is equal to false. Else game over is equal to true. So once we have our player health script up and running, we're going to call this function player hit, and we're going to pass in our current health points. And in the game manager, that will keep track of whether our game is over or whether we're still alive and kicking, and the game continues on. Okay, so that looks good, and we're just gonna save that. And we created this right now mainly so that we could have the game over bool to check. So because we're going to have that be part of the logic for a lot of our functions here on out, because you don't want the enemies attacking if the game's over. You don't want the player moving if the game's over. So we're just thinking ahead a little bit and using the game manager to monitor that so that we can implement the logic that we're going to be needing. All right, so that looks good. So now the part that you've all been waiting for, we are going to get our enemies attacking. Okay, so I'm going to come back over here to Unity editor, and we're going to create a new script. Right click on the scripts folder, create C# script. We're going to call this enemy attack. Okay, and go ahead and open that up and bring that up here. All right, so in the last video, we went ahead and we created our box colliders on our weapons, right? So now we need to write some scripting to be able to make those actually do stuff. So what we want to do is we are going to work on our enemy attack script here. And the first thing I think we want to do is create the variables that we're going to need. So when we are attacking, we want our enemies to attack when we're within a certain range of our hero. All right, so we're going to say serialize field private float range. So range is the variable we're calling it, and we'll set this to about 3F, and that went capital for some reason. Range, there we go, 3F. That looks good. And then we are also going to we don't want our enemies to be able to just attack really fast one right after the other. Let's give them a little bit of breathing room, so they'll attack, they'll have a wait time, and then they'll attack again. Okay, so I'm going to make another serialize field, and that's going to be private float. We're going to call this time between attacks. Okay, and that is going to, we're going to set that as a starter variable of 1F. And so these will be available for editing in the Unity editor. So if we feel like we need to adjust those, we can there. And then we're also going to need our animator, and we're going to call it anim. We are going to need a reference to our player, and that's going to be a game object. We're going to name it player, and we're going to get that from the game manager that we just created. And so we're going to say private bool, and we're going to call this player in range. And so this is going to keep track of whether we are within the range that we specify, okay? And then lastly, we need a reference to the box colliders that are our weapons, okay? And so since some of our enemies have more than one weapon, for instance, the tanker has two, has a left and a right hammer, we need to account for that. So we're going to make our box collider an array. So just by doing that, we have declared that this array is an array of box colliders. Okay, so weapon, we're going to call that weapon colliders. Okay, looks good. And so now on in start, let's go ahead and get reference to all of those things. And we're going to say weapon colliders is equal to get components. And now you're probably used to, in our other ones, we just with get component. But this time, we need the get components in children because, and just going to finish this up real quick and then we'll go take a look. And so we're looking for box colliders in our children. So I'm going to hop back over into Unity real quick. And so our tanker, this would be where we would say get component if we were looking at just our rigid body, nav mesh, capsule colliders, because those are part of the topmost level. But our weapons are way down here nested, and so we need to say get components in children. All right, so that's why we use that one for the weapon box colliders. All right, looks good. And then we are going to say we need to grab our player. So player is equal to, and this is how we get this is how we use our getter that is inside of our game manager. So we'll say game manager dot instance dot player. Okay, good. And then lastly, we'll get our reference to our animator, which is anim equals get component of type animator. All right, so now we have all of our references to our variables that we're going to be needing. So let's get cracking. So how we're going to do this is we are going to simply measure the distance between the enemy and the player, and if it's within our range that we specify, then we are going to trigger our attack. Okay, well actually we're going to set the player in range equal to true or false depending. So in our update function, we are going to do a check for that. So we're going to say if, and we're going to say vector3 dot distance. So hovering over vector3 dot distance, all that does is it returns the distance between A and B. Okay, so we are going to pass in our position, the position of the enemy. So we're going to say transform dot position. Then we're going to pass in the player dot transform dot position. Perfect. And so if the distance is less than range, then we are going to say player in range is equal to true. Else player in range is equal to false. Very cool. So just to do a quick check to make sure that's working, let's go ahead and just print out player in range, just to make sure everything is working up to this point. So save. All right, so save, and let's run this and have our console open. Okay, so we are not having anything happen because we have not assigned the enemy attack script to our enemies. So with the tanker selected, I'm going to say add component, scripts, enemy attack, and same thing for the soldier, add component, scripts, enemy attack, and same thing for the ranger, add components, scripts, enemy attack. And let's run that one more time with our console open. And we also forgot to set an instance of an object, enemy attack.update. All right, so let's see what we need to do back in our, so let's take a look at our enemy attack. And player equals game manager.instance. Oh, I know what we did. Okay, so what we forgot to do is we forgot to have our game manager be in here. So I'm going to create an empty object, rename it to game manager, and then drag our game manager script onto the game manager object. And in our, so now we need to assign our player to the player slot. So I'm going to select hero and drag it onto there. There we go. So save it and run it. There we go. So now we are working. So player in range. Looks like it is stuck on player in range. So let's see what's happening. Maybe our distance is way too big. Okay, well, I feel silly. What I wrote in for the check to see if the player is in range, I wrote player in range. That is definitely not what we want. We want the variable player in range. So that'll be showing true or false depending on whether the player is in range. All right, so let's go back and press play. All right, so now false, 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 false. Then we get close and true, 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 true. False, 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 true. Okay, so it looks like it's working. So just to recap the few things that I needed to do to get it running, we needed to have a game object with the game manager script attached to it and with the player slot for hero, and that's so that we can get a reference to the player by accessing GameManager.instance.player. Okay, and then I needed to fix this silly mistake where I wrote in a string player in range instead of using the variable player in range. All right, so that looks like everything is working perfectly for our check to see whether the player is in range or not. So now what we need to do is we are actually going to create our attack script. Okay, so we are going to use a coroutine for the attack. And so a coroutine is a function that is able to work in code blocks. So in other words, we can start a block of code, and then we can say, wait for a few seconds and then continue on. This is really good for scripting things like animation. So what we're going to do is we're going to say IEnumerator, which is the type for that you want to use for coroutines, and we're going to say attack. And so the check that we want to do is we want to say if the player is in range and game manager.instance.gameover is not equal to false. So in other words, if the player is in range and the game is still going, but this can be rewritten to a more succinct exclamation point in front of GameManager.instance.gameover. And if that is the case, if we are in range and the game is still going, we are going to play our attack animation. So I'm just going to say anim.play attack. Cool. And then I think we will, just like we were talking about with our above, we don't want them to be just attacking a ton in a row, so we are going to implement a yield return new wait 4 seconds, and the amount of time that we want to wait is time between attacks. Okay, so that looks good. Okay, so now if the player is in range and the game is still going, we are going to play the attack animation, then we're going to wait for a specific amount of time, and then we're going to say yield return null, and then we are, whoops, gotta fix that, yield, there we go, and then we are going to say start coroutine. This is how you start coroutines, and the coroutine we are going to start is itself. All right, so this makes it a recursive routine. We are calling it from within itself. And then also to start off the coroutines, you got to start them in, you got to call them in start as well. So up here as well, we're going to say start coroutine attack, and that looks good. All right, so let's see if that works. I'm going to save that, hop back over to our Unity editor, and the Ranger, we're just going to ignore for a while, disable him up here, and let's press play. Oh, hey, there he goes. He's attacking. Let's see if the soldier is also attacking. Perfect. Man, this is fantastic. So cool. Boom, boom. Awesome. Hey, alright, so looking pretty great, you guys. Alright, so go ahead and stop that. Alright, so that's looking pretty great, guys. We got our enemies attacking. So in the next video, we are going to work on the player health script so that we'll be able to detect when the enemies' weapons strike us and deduct health based on that. Alright, so we will see you in the next one. Johnny B with devslopes.com signing off.